June, are you offering to second that motion for me? Thank you so much. I will now put the motion which has been moved and seconded. Please vote accordingly.
And that's unanimous.
Thank you, Heidi. Lovely. There's no request for public participation today, so we're going straight on to general business, which is that we've got the report on the Central City Safer Speeds consultation process. Before I introduce the report, I was going to allow for some time for questions from officers because we haven't had a chance to do that yet. So do I have a speaking list? Councillors who've got questions? Councillor Pannett, you kick us off.
Thanks. Well, David, it's 6 years since we last debated this particular issue, so we're a speedy organisation. So I'm just looking at my diligent board notes, so hopefully this will all make sense. You've got a point on page 10 about encouraging people onto the arterials. You will not be surprised to hear that I'm not in support of that, really. This is for some of us still our suburb. The question then is there any way we can do some more traffic calming?
So through the chair, the intent of that actual statement is in relation to ensuring that non-essential vehicles are not using the city streets, as also highlighted in the body of the report, as pending the decision of council. As the speed limits are implemented, there will be a monitoring regime, and if there are areas of the city where the speeds being identified are not reaching those determined in the guidelines, that there will need to be consideration of those types of traffic calming initiatives that you refer to.
Okay, and then just my second question was around I think the amendment that you're putting up. Again, you won't be in any way surprised that I do want to respond to submitter concerns about extending the area. And in fact, I have Councillor Rush's support on some of that, I understand. So Oriental Bay, Roseneath, Mount Victoria, nice sort of contiguous area. The question is, how quickly can we start work on that?
So as highlighted in the suggested amendments, we are very conscious that through the submission process and also the hearings themselves, there was a lot of call for expanding those opportunities, not just a minor extension beyond the CBD, but also in parts of the suburb, etc. The team themselves, the Wellington City team, is looking at a program of safer speeds across the broader Wellington City Council network. And those that are associated with improvements from Let's Get Wellington Moving will come through as the program progresses, and these types of initiatives are implemented. So I can't give you a definitive timeframe, but what I can say is that the team is looking at a WCC-wide series of programs and initiatives that would look at those opportunities for safer speeds across the city.
So some of these areas won't have anything to do with Let's Get Wellington Moving. So how then is that issue resolved, and when are we going to actually get a paper on the table?
Yep. So the team are currently working on a program of works, one of which is safety around schools, one of which is safer speeds generally, and we will be bringing back a package of those programs for consideration through the LTP process. What has traditionally occurred in the past, we have identified asset management and renewals as responding to a particular asset class, either the footpath, the curb, the road surface. What we want to do is take a program approach and an outcomes approach and package those up into outcomes so that we focus our finances and our funding onto those outcomes. So prior to the LTP, and part of the LTP consideration would be looking at those programs of work which would have those particular focuses. As I said, one of those is looking at safer speeds more generally.
Okay, so in other words, we should see some of that this year.
That's right.
Right, okay, well that's awesome. So can we be, sorry, the last amendment that I saw. Can that be quite explicit about that, just so we can give confidence to the community that asked for that? That we will start to be looking at that?
Yes. Leave that with me, and I can suggest a few minor tweaks to what I think should be the new 6. I can provide an addition around there in terms of both the consideration as the Let's Get Wellington Moving program progresses, and also as part of the LTP process, if you're happy with that.
I'm extremely happy with that. Thank you. You've made my day. Great.
I try.
Thank you, David. That would be excellent. What I'm going to suggest actually is that after we've had question time, we might just adjourn briefly, because I'm conscious that we've come straight out of another meeting and people might need a bathroom break. And that will give us a chance to kind of tinker around with the wording of any amendments before we introduce the paper, if that suits everyone. I'm seeing lots of nods, so I'll just go ahead and do that. On my speaking list, I've got Councillor Calvert next, and then myself. Any other questions, Councillors Foon? Councillor Calvert.
Thank you. Yeah, look, I have a few questions, and actually just follow just your answers to Councillor Pennant. And you say this, your team's looking at a wider Safer Speeds program. Is this part of your is this part of a current work program? I mean, I'm just wondering whether you've got the capacity to do that at this stage.
So through the chair, yes, effectively what we're doing is taking the opportunity as we look at the LTP to think of how we do that in a much smarter way. And so that is by, rather than looking at individual projects, we're looking at programs and outcomes more specifically. So the team are being smarter about the way that they consider how money is spent and allocated to particular outcomes as opposed to particular assets.
Okay. And it was actually clause 41, which talked about how officers have expedited the project timeline. What was the original implementation date? Do you know?
Hugh, correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection was September, October for proposed implementation.
And
yeah,
how?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so how have you managed to bring it forward by 2 months?
Yep. So effectively, we've been able to consider the feedback, look at the timing of both the subcommittee and the actual decision of council, and making sure that we have aligned the consideration of NZTA and also the requirements we need with the police, so that that can happen immediately rather than sequentially. So we've been running some things in parallel in the preparation of things happening, but also noting at the end of the day, it has to be a council decision that ultimately implements it. So noting that some of that work may have been redundant, but we've balanced that up with the benefit of expediency.
And obviously, Safer Speeds is in a city, including Featherston Street and Victoria Street. How does this tie in with the current initiative under Innovating Streets to actually remove a lane?
Yep, so it fits in terms of the consultation and the engagement that is live for the traffic resolution for that. As we have highlighted, the significant benefit that you will get from Safer Speeds is a game changer for the city. The ones that you refer to, those particular projects, are related to the COVID response. Now, obviously, we don't know how long the level 1 implications, etc., will occur, and also noting that we are still keen, and certainly the government is still keen to ensure social distancing even at a level 1 status. So our recommendation through that is that those initiatives are still relevant until such time as a vaccine is also identified, etc.
Sorry, I mean, we could take this offline, but I'm just a little bit concerned about your comments about social distancing under level 1, because that's certainly not what's come out in the media, or it's not my understanding from what government has said. I mean, they were very happy for crowds to gather over the weekend. So
Thank you,
they are,
Councillor
but-
Calvert. I think that
Yeah.
I would appreciate taking that offline. I
Yep.
think that's not the subject of today's discussion, and there will be
Yeah.
time to debate that in another meeting.
Yeah. So look, and I've got one other question, and that is in terms of the analysis. I think it was the Let's Get Wellington Moving program did the analysis of the feedback of all the submissions.
No, that particular analysis was contracted through the program by an independent service who does this stuff all the time.
So
can you provide that detail, please?
Yeah, so as part of the working agreement for the early delivery works through Let's Get Wellington Moving.
Sorry, I can't hear.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, so as part of the delivery agreement for the early delivery of Let's Get Wellington Moving projects, council officers as well as MZTA staff worked with external contractors who did the bulk of the analysing, and then we worked with them to sort of present the report.
Yeah. So the external contracts, I just want to check: are they professionals in their own right in terms of the research and evaluation?
Yes, they are, and we've used them for a number of different consultations before. So
okay.
Very well versed in the council process. And
yeah, but I'm just checking they're well versed in research and evaluation.
Yes, they are.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Councillor Calvert. I've got some questions. Then I have Councillors Foon and Young. Anybody else want to wave their hand at me to get on the speaking list? Nope, looks like we're good at this point. Oh, Councillor Rush, excellent. I will pop you on there. Officers, my question was about some of the objections that came through in the consultation. So in paragraph 29, it says that some of the public objections were around the idea that lower speeds will increase congestion. And the belief that people already drive at 30 kilometres per hour. And I was just wondering if you'd tell us, what does the evidence actually say about people's views on these two issues?
If I could invite Hugh, I understand that he provided a written response, and it'd be great to get that verbalised in the formal part of the meeting.
So do you want me to read that now, or are we going to do that in the meeting? Sorry, just to be clear.
Yes, if you're happy to just read out what you've effectively sent to councillors so that it becomes public record, that would be great.
Sure. So in attachment 4, there's the current average speed information, and there's a mix of streets and where the current operating speed is either higher or lower than 30. We can get more detailed information of a specific street at a specific time. I pulled that and it was available on the website. I just didn't want to include it in the report because it was about 86 pages long or something. So, but we can get that information for you. And we're not aware of any evidence that lower speed limits in a central city environment increase congestion significantly.
The other thing that I would reference to that in terms of congestion, a lot of questions about congestion is not necessarily related to speed, but related to the sequencing of traffic lights and those other things that occur across the network. So that all gets brought into the mix in terms of when you consider congestion across your city network.
Thank you. All right, Councillor Foon.
Flicking between computers and I'm forgetting which one I'm plugged into at the moment. Thank you. This was most interesting reading. The two questions I have were, and this would probably link into Councillor Pannett's earlier statements, but were the the responses about Taranaki and Kent and Cambridge, with Taranaki being highly asked to also be one of the 30K streets. David, one of the reasons why we didn't include this in the first place was about the MTR, MRT possibilities. Do we have a shift on that at all yet?
Through the chair, so there were two matters of consideration that we highlighted to council. One was that that particular corridor was identified as a potential mass rapid transit route as part of the Let's Get Wellington Moving program. That business case work is currently underway and is seriously considering that corridor and what that might look like. The other consideration that we highlighted to councillors was that the very nature of Taranaki Street as it currently stands does not suit itself to reducing speed limits without serious investment on the physical consideration of that particular corridor. So effectively, in order to bring it down physically in speed, significant capital investment would need to occur. That was not intended as this part of the process, and highlighting that if council was as a mind, once the MRT consideration has been fully considered, could revisit how Taranaki looks to ensure that both the posted speed and the physical environment of that corridor suits that particular outcome. But that would be a different consideration for the future.
Thanks for refreshing my memory. There's been a few papers since then.
There have been one or two.
Our second question was about engagement. I actually think you guys did a great job on the engagement for this. The image was really noticeable and it seems to have got a really good, so the question is, would you consider that this has been a successful engagement and the feedback, are you happy with the feedback that the quantity of feedback that you've got from this?
Through the chair, certainly I would consider it has been a very high level of engagement. As has been referenced at the beginning of the session, we have been here before. And certainly the desire and the people coming out and wanting to have their say about it has certainly reaffirmed that shift in desire for safer speeds across the city since the attempt 8 years ago, noting that Councillor Pannett, that wasn't a conversation that you had with me because I wasn't even here. But I appreciate that has shifted and there was certainly a great level of engagement. And I appreciate those comments about the style of the engagement, and we'll make sure that that's fed back to the team as well.
Yeah, thanks, David. That would be good. Can you just clarify, was it 6 or 8 years ago?
I think it was 6. My
6,
apologies.
Iona?
Yeah, it was 6 because I was on council and I wasn't on council 8 years ago.
Okay, great. That's good. Thank you, Nicola. I'm glad you're still here. Great. Okay. Thanks, David.
Lovely, thank you, Councillor Young, and then I've got Councillor Rush.
So I have a bit of a dilemma here because talking about the last time we tried to do safer speeds and I opposed them because I thought it was a waste of $250,000 for various reasons, which I won't go through now. But David and I, we've had various discussions over the fact that I thought if it's a way of making cycling safer, which would be really good, and it would save the disruption of putting cycleways through. But now we have this innovative streets thing, which is going to be really disruptive. So I'm not sure. I feel that my justification for supporting safer speeds has been ripped out or is being ripped out from underneath my feet.
Through the chair, I appreciate that there are a number of initiatives occurring and it's probably hard to keep track of exactly what each one is trying to achieve. Innovating streets is purely about thinking quite differently and just testing and trialling things as to how we imagine our streets.
Pathway to permanence, Mr. Chick.
Correct. So there is a temporary nature to them, but the desire and the aspiration is to see how we can transform those streets into more permanent outcomes. But the innovation is about the trialling and testing it in a temporary way.
So you weren't at council when we had the debacle of Lower Tory Street, were you?
Yes, I was.
I mean, that was pretty bloody, especially if you were a local councillor and the portfolio leader.
And the beauty of testing and trialling is that you acknowledge sometimes you are not going to get it right. the ability to then adjust and make sure you get that right, that's the whole purpose of them. But what I would say is the other aspect of what we're trying to do across the city streets is just that. It's the City Streets program. And that is the one that will, through Let's Get Wellington Moving and the work that we're doing as an organisation, see the transformation of our streets in a way that we all aspire to. And as I mentioned before, the reduction of the speed limit enables us to think very, very differently about the physical shape of those spaces and the way pedestrians, and particularly those of a slower mode, are going to enjoy them.
I'm going to miss you when you've gone, David.
And I too, likewise.
Thank you, Councillor Young. Councillor Rush.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, first of all, I've done a little. I simply haven't had time to really engage as well as I'd like to with this material. But I have gone through. I did go through a lot of the pie charts and bar charts and all that sort of thing. One of the things I noticed is that what I do know, and which I have mentioned to you all before from the census data, is 60% of our commuters drive, 20% are on public transport, 10% are home, 4% cycle. I think the rest all walk. What was noticeable was that proportionately in the survey, people responding was quite a different proportion. And as a consequence, I would like to understand, I'm not asking you to do this, but I suspect that if the weighting of those responding reflected the users and their views as in the survey, you would probably find actually there is less support for this initiative than is currently in this document. Do you have any thoughts on that, David?
I certainly do. And I think depending on how you do weight it, I think the overwhelming response, which was different from this year, is that we have definitely seen a shift of those people who are currently driving wanting to also be able to enjoy our city streets in a much more pleasant way. So I think the evidence is from the data that we're seeing through the responses is that people are definitely wanting to have a different experience, and including those that have traditionally come by car. And that's certainly come through in the evidence.
Sure. Some of the things that Councillor Young just mentioned would address that, but one of the things I find peculiar, we, if I'm allowed to mix our meetings, we've just come from a meeting where a lot of emphasis was placed on bus times and shortened journeys by minutes and so forth, and there's no data in here that I can see, and as I say, I haven't read it as thoroughly as I would like to have. Doesn't seem to be any data on whether slowing the speeds will mean longer journey times and whether that would result in productivity loss. One of the things I do know from submissions I've seen on the duplicate Mount Vic tunnel is submitters with businesses out in Rongotai saying that they effectively have two delivery vans, one for the traffic and one for the deliveries. And obviously that's a illogical extension, but is there any data that we have around productivity and what this will do to productivity at all?
I might just jump in quickly and then ask Hugh and Paul perhaps to jump in as well if they've got other things to add. There is certainly international examples around the world, well documented, that demonstrate that if, as I referenced before, if you manage to sequence your traffic signals, etc., which also happens to coincide with a reasonable walking speed in terms of the sequence. Interestingly enough, the 30k speed limit also coincides with pedestrians being able to get from one block to another, so that your sequencing of traffic lights also hugely benefits for pedestrians, that there is minimal impact to travel time, because what you find is as people accelerate from a traffic signal or from a stop start, that they accelerate up to a point and then they decelerate because they're coming to the next intersection and stop. Whereas if you can get a much more fluid movement of traffic, that's much more efficient to the network. And so those benefits or those impacts are actually minimal.
Okay, I mean, we all know with the relief that one feels when you actually get to the next lights and it goes amber, but you get through it, and with much relief, you laugh at the people behind you.
I'm not going to comment about your driving behaviour, Councillor Rush.
No surprises, Sean. You look like that type of driver.
That was a rhetorical statement, you guys. Okay, just a final one on carbon emissions, and I just spotted this. I've raised this before. You mentioned on page 11 of the document, clause 2.2.2, noise and air quality. There's some data from the European Federation for Transport Environment that 30k speed limit down from 50 reduces carbon dioxide by about 15%. I can't find that. I've been struggling to find that since the meeting started. Is that data available? Because the data that I've seen suggests that cars have an optimal speed, usually around somewhere between 50 and 100, and that's the optimal pace to drive at. Now, I know that if you do stop-start, that's where the real problem arises, but I'd like to see that data if you've got it.
Yeah, we can certainly provide the information from where that data came from.
Thanks. Cheers.
Thanks, Councillor Rush. Matt Foster.
Thank you, David. Thank you too. Two quick questions. The first one of them is just the perennial around police enforcement. I know that when I've talked to the police, they've said yes, they will. If we ask them to, they will enforce. And I have actually the other day seen some police enforcement in Kelvin Village, which I thought was great. Question is, do we have any feedback from them as to what level they enforce at? In other words, the discretion that they give. In other words, does 30 mean 35 or 40, or what does it mean?
Through the chair, it'd be inappropriate for me to speak to operational police matters. That would be a matter for the police and how they enforce. All I can say that they are committed to enforcement.
Your Sir Humphrey is just amazing, David.
Thank you, Your Worship.
We will miss that immensely. Okay, and the second question was just around cycling speeds. I can remember when Paul Barker showed us, you know, the whole lot of those sort of matrices around speed related to volume, etc. That when you got the speed down, and this is following Nicola's question, when you got the speed down, you actually didn't need to separate. In other words, you didn't need cycle lanes in those spaces. So have we got some sort of further advice as to what the relationship between reducing speed and needing separate facilities is in any given space?
I'll ask Paul to respond to that. And you might also want to pick up on Councillor Rush's comment about the speed and intersections as well, if I haven't covered that correctly as well.
Cool. Yep. So there absolutely is a relationship between speed, volume, and mass. And we know that if we're in a low volume, low speed street, we can share quite comfortably. The mass makes a difference. So if we were to get the Golden Mile, for instance, just down to being buses only, it may be actually it's not that comfortable for those on bikes, and we may still look for separation. But certainly if it's low volume, low speed, we don't need to provide for separation. The volume would make a difference. So that comment that Councillor Young made about the Featherston Victoria Street, absolutely a safer speed limit will be absolutely fantastic for walking and cycling, but the volume along that corridor may still lead us to need for us to look for separation and provide for separated cycleways.
So thanks for that, Paul. So as we look at this from a network perspective, and that was the conversation we were having in the last conversation 20 minutes ago, 35 minutes ago, around the Golden Mile and changes to the Golden Mile, and then we were talking about Featherston Victoria and how all this all fits together. It'll be really good, especially if we change the nature of Featherston and Victoria, how that plays out with numbers of vehicles, speed, and need for separated facilities or not need for separated facilities?
Yeah, look, and part of having the blanket speed limit, the simplicity of it would enable somebody on a bike to be able to traverse the entire central city network comfortably. We know that people are, don't just cycle through town. They're actually, it's a destination, so they're going into all of the parking garages, and so all of those side roads just make sense. That we're never going to provide a separated or even a painted cycle lane outside of the parking up to every business. So we would look to have a couple of strategic corridors that complemented the main arterials for motorists and for the bus corridors. So we would try and separate those out. So we'd have buses on one road, the freight and vehicles on another, and then a cycling route on a different route. We just start running out of roads in our central city.
Yes, I know.
So we're trying to plan this network, and it's a part of a Let's Get Wellington moving function as much as it is the city function.
So look, absolutely no issue.
Speed limits.
So obviously, I absolutely strongly support the lower speed limits. The question I'm just asking is in the wider context of what that means for the Let's Get Wellington moving, separation of facilities, etc. So when we see that picture, that'd be great. We don't have to make that decision today.
Yep. Thank you. Was that all?
Thank you, Mayor Foster. Councillor Calvert, you've got your hand up again. Do you have another question? Excellent. Over to you.
I just wanted to know, I couldn't see it, but maybe it's there. Is there going to be a formal review or some sort of review after 6 months on how it's going? And I'm just thinking of perhaps it might change traffic patterns. So traffic might avoid some of the slower speed streets, and what it will do is put more traffic back onto the higher speed streets. And just wondering whether there's any plan to review, or maybe not review, but just to sort of look at the potential unintended consequences.
So through the chair, one of the additional suggested officer supporter amendments is talking about and just highlighting the fact that we will be reviewing how the streets are being used. The other important thing to note is that through our Transport Operations Centre, our team is constantly monitoring and reviewing what's happening on the network, and they have really good data by which they can determine what the implications of changes in the network are actually doing to the network. And so that review plus that information will help us understand if further adjustments and refinements need to occur in terms of light sequence, whatever that might be.
Thank you. And not of Mr. Chick, but Chair, I'm still a little bit confused on how the recommendations will go to strategy and policy, and what happens at that point. So I wouldn't mind some conversation about that.
Fair enough. Heidi, are you here? I think that we got an email from staff today saying that essentially we're making recommendations today. We don't have the delegated authority to make a decision at this committee. So we are making a recommendation to SPC. That my understanding is that those recommendations will go to SPC and will be debated again at SPC, and any amendments can be made at that point if needed.
Correct, Madam Chair.
Okay,
Thank you, Heidi.
So there could be a debate at strategy and policy. We make a recommendation for, say, for the 30k speed limits to go in, and then strategy and policy could vote to overturn that, or could vote to change how it looks. Is that right?
That is my understanding. Yes.
Okay.
That's exactly what happened last time.
Okay.
Right.
So I'm sure it won't happen this time.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Just to clarify, though, while that's definitely the case, the opportunity is basically to reject it. because as we highlighted in the body of the traffic resolution report, to add additional streets into it at this stage would not be the correct procedure. You would have to engage on those. So effectively, you can make the amendments that that improve, but don't detract, if you know what I mean, from the original.
So you're essentially saying is we obviously can't add extra streets in because we haven't consulted on those, but we can
Correct.
take streets out.
Correct.
Thank you, David. Councillor Foon, did you have another question?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. On the third attachment to 2.2.1, economic vibrancy, obviously very relevant to the petition that we had given to us this morning. My question is, how will we measure this? If this is really the vision that we're after, or one of the visions, but it would be really useful to be able to go back to the business community with the outcomes that we're seeing or not. So yes, what is the way we will look to measure that?
So through the chair, the Wellington Analytics unit that has been established, while their primary function has been focused on transport, they are looking more broadly at a holistic set of measures, both qualitative and quantitative. So some of these are almost by sentiment in terms of how business is going, and we've got good access to that. We also work, and so will the Wellington Analytics Unit be working closely with Wellington NZ in terms of that economic. Wellington NZ does a range of analysis around the spend, etc., that we can get good data and information about that. That will help us in that.
Great, thanks, David. So we have someone that we're liaising with there on a regular basis to get the critical information that we're after.
That's right. It is, to be fair, as I've highlighted, it is a developing conversation. But the Wellington Analytics Unit is a new entity, effectively.
Right,
that is really starting to expand its remit in terms of the types of things it measures and keeps a track of. Traditionally, it has been focused primarily on the transport type analytics, but certainly now looking more broader with GW, ourselves, and others, including Wellington NZ, around those broader, more holistic analytic type information.
Great. Okay, that's exciting. Thank you. Good to know.
Thank you. Councillors, do we have any further questions for officers? I don't see any. So as I suggested earlier, I'm going to propose that we adjourn the meeting. Perhaps will 10 minutes be enough for you, David, to have a little bit of a break and get through that wording, or should I give you 15 instead?
I'm ready to go now, but I'm conscious about other people.
Excellent. Okay, we'll make it 10 minutes.
Yep.
10 minutes for everyone.
I have an email ready to go, which has it highlighted in red that adds to my previous email.
Thank you very much. So if you can send that around, and Heidi can get that up on the screen for us while we take a break for 10 minutes so everyone can refill their cup of tea.
3:55?
Yes, 3:55. Thank you, everyone. See you then. Remember to turn off your cameras.
Bye, everybody.
Everyone, are we still waiting for Iona and Nicola? There's Nicola turning her camera on. There's Iona, lovely. All right. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your cup of tea or your biscuit or whatever it is that you got up to with your 10 minutes. Now that we've had time for questions, I'm going to introduce the paper properly. So first thing I need to do is table a document which outlines a small change to Appendix 1. This was requested by officers, and when I move the motion, it will refer to the tabled document. Officers, did anybody want to just give a quick explanation about why we've had to table? There we go, there it is. There was just a slight error that was in one of the appendices. that has been tidied up by officers, as you can see there.
Do you want an explanation on that? Sorry, Councillor.
Go for it, Hugh.
Yeah, just to David's point before about expediting the process. This double checking of signage essentially would normally take place before we come to committee. Just one of the risks we took on, and it's a very minor amendment to move the sign on the terrace up the hill, essentially, if you're standing on the terrace, about 23 metres to ensure it's in a more appropriate place.
Great. Thank you, Hugh. All right, having tabled that, I'm ready to move the following motion with officer support. Can we see the motion up on the screen, please, Heidi? So all of these, I'm not moving these pro forma, all of these recommendations have officer support. And those two are the two that have been circulated earlier today. Which was Councillor Pannett was talking about the work on some other parts of the city and the monitoring that's going to be happening once the speed limits have been put in place. Okay, thank you, Heidi. I'm really conscious that this is kind of the first debate, and that we will actually have a second debate on this issue in a very short order when this paper comes up to SPC. So my goal is to not make too much of a meal of it. Our favourite saying at the moment is we don't need to make this bigger than Ben-Hur, since we're going to have another go at this debate in a week or two's time at SPC. But I am going to still indulge the sound of my own voice for a little bit while I introduce the paper, which is really to just sort of say, what is the problem that we're trying to solve here? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? And it's the data that we have in this paper that since 2014, we've had 22 serious injuries inside of the safer speed zone in Wellington. And 15 of those were to pedestrians and cyclists. On average, in the past decade, we've had 14 DSIs, deaths and serious injuries in the city. And we know that pedestrians and cyclists are the most hurt and injured when they are part of a crash. So pedestrians and cyclists make up only 15% of crashes, but they make up 67% of deaths and serious injuries, because we are all very frail creatures. And the other thing is then, okay, so if that's the problem we're trying to solve, is this actually going to solve it? Is this actually going to help? And there's research in the paper that shows that speed is the most significant thing that you can affect when you want to try and keep people safe on our roads. When London reduced the speeds on their streets to 20 miles per hour in a whole lot of areas, they saw a 38% reduction in deaths and serious injuries on their street, which is pretty significant. And in Wellington, when we reduced speeds to 30 kilometres per hour on parts of our city streets, the evidence shows that we saw a 38% reduction in all injury crashes. So not serious injuries, but any injury crashes. So we've got some pretty good evidence that this is actually going to help with safety for our pedestrians and cyclists in our city. And it's really about, what do we value? What kind of city are we trying to create? And we want to create a city that's safe, but we also want something that's vibrant, that supports people spending time in the city, and that supports the retail and hospitality businesses that we all really love about Wellington. And the evidence that we've got is that these kind of changes are actually good for business. We know that when we lower the speeds, we decrease the noise from the cars going past, and we reduce pollution. So we actually improve the air quality. Makes our city a nicer place to be if you're a pedestrian. People spend more time because it's a nicer place to be. And when people spend more time, they spend more money. And so this is actually something that can be really good for businesses in our city. And as we've heard from officers during the conversation, the evidence shows that it's neutral for congestion and travel times. The best international research we have is that the impact is minimal. The final 2 points I'd like to make is, one is that fundamentally for me, in the end, anyone can make a mistake as a pedestrian, and it shouldn't cost them their lives or put them in a wheelchair for the rest of their lives. We should be able to make mistakes and not actually have to pay such a heavy price for that in our city. And finally, I think back to something that Isabella Cawthorne said when she came to present to us, and she talked about a fundamental issue, which is that we can't make our streets both a fast place to move through and a pleasant place to be in. You have to pick one. It can be a place, or you can prioritize movement. And what we've done in this proposal actually balances those two things really well, I think. We've said, look, we're going to keep a few streets that are primarily for movement, and we're going to keep those speeds at 50 kilometers per hour. And the rest of the streets, we're going to start thinking about them more as the places that we want to spend time in. And how can we enhance that? So some of our streets are places and some of our streets are for movement. And we've just accepted that we can't have both in the same place, and we're going to pick and choose. And I think the pragmatist in me says that the fact that we've got people who wish we would include more streets and people who wish we would take some streets out means that we've probably got it about right. So I'm looking forward to supporting this paper and sending it up to SPC for us to have a full debate. And Councillor Pannett is going to be seconding the paper.
Thank you, Councillor Condie. And look, while the cars might be going 50k in our city and fast, this council obviously hasn't moved so quickly on this particular issue. 6 years it has taken to get this back on the table, but I'm really happy. And I'd like to give a big thanks to staff for the work that they've done on it. This is a huge report, heaps of work, so thank you. And also thank you to the submitters. I really enjoyed the submission, so thank you for the public for doing their part. So this is a good day, and I guess for me it is not only just about saving people's lives, but it's about changing the culture of our streets and our city. You know, my political goal is really to end the car dominant culture. That we need to look at other modes so it's more in balance, and this will really help to do that. We've talked about being a child-friendly city, a city friendly for disabled people. This also makes a contribution to those worthy objectives. And as we talked about this morning, children do transport themselves around the inner city. Councillor Condie, I possibly do have a slight disagreement with you and the staff on the arterials. Look, you know, as Councillor Foon particularly knows, I made my start in politics opposing the inner city bypass, which was to allow traffic to travel very quickly around through the central city, whilst claiming it wasn't really going through the central city. And it has had a huge impact on our CBD. I don't think anyone, except for emergency vehicles generally, has that much of a need to go very quickly. And you know, this is a very large residential area, so I have not given up on efforts to get and traffic calm some of those streets. They are still very hostile areas, and I'll just remind you, for example, Cable Street is outside one of the most visited attractions in the city. So that would be good to see that calm down. But my happiest moment, Mr. Chick, thank you so much. That amendment is fantastic. I love it. We are moving quickly then. Staff have really listened to what the public have said, what councillors have said, and we will be looking at some further speed reductions. So obviously the community I live in, some have expressed a strong desire for lower speeds. And I'm sure there will be other suburbs too, not just Pukehinau, Lambton, but there will be other suburbs around the city that would like beautiful places to be and safer places, particularly for the most vulnerable road users. So very happy. Thank you very much to everyone again.
Thanks, Councillor Pannett. Do we have debate? Councillor Foon, were you giving me a wave that you'd like to speak in debate? All right, we can start with Councillor Foon. Anyone else who would like to speak during debate? You can give me a wave if you change your mind. Oh, you're still muted, Councillor Foon.
How's that? Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to echo Councillor Pannett in thanking the 1,712 people who submitted. it really helped. So we had a talk last night about, does it really make a difference? And I think that it really does, particularly in this case. So thanks to everybody for that. I also want to bring up this morning that we've had the business community requesting a pedestrian, a traffic-free zone on Courtney Place. And so this is taking a step toward that, where we're making our streets safer and a nicer place to be. But actually just reflecting on what we saw in COVID, how people were really living in our streets. And this is the objective that we want to get to through this Safer Streets paper. So thank you to everyone who committed to letting us know what you think. And yes, I am happy to be at this point as well.
Thank you, Councillor Foon. Any other debate from councillors? All right, I will waive my right of reply since you've all been so kind as to keep our debate short. I'll do you the same in return, and we can go straight to putting this motion to the vote, please.
So that's 7 votes for, 1 against.
Thank you, Heidi.
Sorry, can we record that as a division? Sorry, I should have asked. Is that okay?
Thanks,
I can
Councillor
record
Bennett.
that. Yep.
Thanks,
you.
Heidi. All right, I declare the motion carried. So thank you, everyone. We'll close as usual. I'll declare the meeting closed, and we'll close as usual with the karakia, and I hope everyone has a lovely evening. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te urutapu nui, kia wātea, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua, I te ara takatū. Koia rā I rongo, whakairia aka ki runga, kia wātea, ai rā, kua wātea. Thanks, everyone. Good evening.
Thanks, Jenny.
We've made it
Cheers.
to the end of 4